Ford Motor Company has a long history filled with both triumphs and disappointments, and some of those disappointments have become legendary among automotive enthusiasts. Despite Ford being renowned for iconic successes like the Model T and the Mustang, there were times when the company launched vehicles that did not meet sales targets, did not satisfy consumer needs, or were simply overshadowed by strong competitors. Understanding these vehicles offers a fascinating look into corporate decision-making, market trends, and consumer expectations. It is also a reminder that the automotive industry is constantly evolving, and even major players can stumble when they attempt something too ambitious, too risky, or too far removed from what drivers actually want. Part of the intrigue lies in exploring why these cars failed to gain traction, what Ford's internal reasoning might have been at the time, and how the automotive press received these models. Flops can arise for many reasons, such as questionable styling, subpar engineering, inflated prices, or simply launching at the wrong time in economic history. Sometimes, it is a combination of all these factors. Through the years, Ford has introduced several cars and trucks that promised much but ultimately delivered results that left executives, dealerships, and consumers scratching their heads. This is especially interesting when looking back at the late 1950s, a period that saw extravagant designs and a fierce competition with other major manufacturers. The Ford Edsel is perhaps the most famous example of a flop from this era, but there were others, and each has its own story to tell. One might notice that many of these so-called failures have a cult following today, as collectors and historians have come to appreciate their unique design choices and mechanical quirks. The spotlight will be on the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns, particularly the Continental models that many consider to be major underperformers for Ford. At the same time, other Ford flops like the Pinto and the Mustang II will make an appearance for context, illustrating that this was far from the only instance in which Ford found itself scrambling to fix consumer perception and corporate profitability. Stay tuned for a closer look at how a massive Lincoln nearly derailed Ford's luxury car ambitions, and how that story ties in with other legendary failures that still manage to fascinate car enthusiasts today. The 1958 to 1960 Lincolns did not exist in a vacuum, and understanding how other Ford flops set the stage might reveal the hidden threads that connect them all. This is where it gets really interesting. Ford's Edsel fiasco was already brewing, so do not miss how that debacle foreshadowed what came next. Despite Ford wanting to innovate, it sometimes forgot to ask the public if it was innovating in the right direction. The Edsel is a name that consistently resurfaces whenever people discuss the greatest flops in automotive history. Introduced for the 1958 model year, it was intended to slot between Ford and Mercury, and the company invested vast sums in hype and marketing before the public even caught a glimpse of the vehicle. It was a bold move, perhaps too bold, as consumers were confused about what the Edsel was supposed to be. The name was derived from Edsel Ford, son of Henry Ford, and Ford's marketing department trumpeted its arrival as if it were a revolutionary product destined to change the industry. However, the Edsel ended up being an odd blend of styling choices, including the now infamous vertical grille that some found awkward. It also arrived just when a recession was hitting, sapping consumer confidence in expensive new cars. While poor timing contributed heavily to the Edsel's downfall, there were also quality control issues and an overall sense that the Edsel did not live up to its lofty promises of innovation. Many of its design elements were shared with other Ford and Mercury products, leading some buyers to feel it was nothing more than a rebadged version of existing cars. Instead of feeling special, it felt overpriced. The buying public was unimpressed, and sales were dismal. Within a few short years, Edsel production ceased, sealing its fate and etching its name into pop culture infamy. This event shook Ford to the core, creating a level of corporate caution when it came to flamboyant design and untested concepts, at least for a while. However, Ford was not done taking risks in the late 1950s. In the luxury segment, the Lincoln line was also struggling to keep pace with Cadillac and Imperial. To be competitive, Ford believed that bigger and more powerful was the path forward, but the resulting products met with lukewarm reception. The flamboyant styling of the late 1950s was evident everywhere, so it was not a problem exclusive to Ford, but the company definitely took that design language to extremes with the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns and their Continental counterparts. These cars were physically massive and loaded with features, yet they often missed the mark when it came to refinement or understated elegance, which was what many luxury buyers were starting to prefer. Stay tuned for how these behemoths came to life and why they struggled to impress the market, especially when Lincoln had previously enjoyed a reputation for classic styling and superb engineering. It is time to see how these giants stacked up against competitors and whether the resulting flop was truly deserved or an overreaction by the public. Like the Edsel, the story of these Lincolns involves timing, engineering challenges, and consumer tastes that shifted faster than Ford could adapt. Before focusing on the larger Lincoln fiasco, it is worth noting that Ford had already attempted a luxury offshoot with the Continental Mark II, launched in 1956 under the short-lived Continental division. This division aimed to deliver exclusive high-end automobiles that would compete directly with prestigious nameplates and take Ford to new heights of luxury. However, production costs were astronomical, and sales failed to justify the expense. The Mark II was extremely elegant, but it was priced so high that it ended up being unprofitable. Ford dissolved the Continental division, though the name would resurface in various forms under the Lincoln badge in subsequent years. That move set the stage for the vehicles now remembered as the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns and Continentals. By the late 1950s, fins, chrome, and excess were the order of the day, and Ford decided to go all in. The 1958 Lincoln was larger, heavier, and more elaborate than its predecessors. Being a unibody design of enormous proportions, it was a triumph of engineering in some respects, but also an unwieldy beast in others. Engineers were worried about structural rigidity, so they added copious amounts of bracing, which pushed the weight even higher. Buyers faced hefty fuel consumption from the powerful engines, which measured over 7 litres in displacement and delivered impressive horsepower numbers, but at the cost of poor efficiency. Despite the size, there was a sense that the interior styling and the ride comfort did not match expectations for a top-tier luxury car. Complaints about ride quality, road noise, and other minor issues chipped away at the car's reputation. This was also a time when Cadillac was refining its approach, offering cars that were just as attention-getting, but perhaps more polished. Imperial, too, was in the race. The Lincoln line found itself overshadowed by the brand recognition and marketing might of its rivals. Ford, meanwhile, was still reeling from the Edsel failure and trying to figure out how to salvage its broader portfolio. In the midst of this turmoil, the Continental name was folded back under Lincoln, introducing models like the so-called Mark III or Mark IV, although that nomenclature was retroactively assigned and can be confusing. These late 1950s Continentals were massive unibody cars that demanded attention on the road but did not capture enough buyers. Stay with this exploration to see how these Lincolns were received by the motoring press and the public, and how their reputation evolved over time. Next, discover the specific technical quirks that made these Lincolns both fascinating and frustrating. These 1958 to 1960 Lincolns, including Continental-branded models, were indeed among the largest unibody cars on the market. One might argue that the only unibody vehicles to exceed them in length or weight came later, such as certain Imperials in the early 1970s. Regardless, when one observes the dimensions of a 1958 or 1959 Lincoln, it is immediately obvious how significant they are. The wheelbase alone exceeded 130 inches, which dwarfed many competitors. Everything about these cars screamed excess. The engines were massive, usually around 430 cubic inches, translating to roughly 7 liters of displacement. Horsepower ratings were strong, and the torque output was substantial, enabling these heavy cars to move with surprising vigor when prodded. Yet, this extravagance did not necessarily translate into the upscale driving experience that luxury buyers anticipated. Reports from the period mention that while the car had presence, its handling left something to be desired. Additional bracing for the unibody contributed to a stiffer structure, which in theory should have been beneficial. However, the added weight and the complexity of the design led to a harshness in the ride that was noticeable. Ford attempted to address this in the 1960 model by enhancing sound deadening to reduce road noise, but by then, consumer preferences were already shifting. The late 1950s style of flamboyant tail fins and ostentatious designs was transitioning toward a more restrained elegance as the 1960s approached. Inside the cabin, the dashboard featured a mid-century modern flair, complete with unique controls. One example was the single knob system that handled various HVAC functions. Turning the knob selected the mode, while pulling it out activated the fan. This was a quirky setup, especially by modern standards, but it contributed to the car's sense of individuality. Further intrigue came from optional features such as automatic headlamp dimming, known as the Autotronic Eye. These advanced touches showed that Ford was not skimping on innovation, but the overall package still felt off kilter to many. Despite the criticisms, these cars found loyal enthusiasts who appreciated their style and grandeur. Today, some collectors prize the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns for their unique place in automotive history. They represent a time when manufacturers were not afraid to push the envelope, sometimes past the comfort zone of mainstream buyers. Get ready to see how this epic scale of design and technology stacked up against the competition, and whether these Lincolns could hold their own in a marketplace craving something new. Cadillac and Imperial were the prime competitors for Lincoln during this period. Cadillac was known for its trend-setting styling and consistent innovation, while Imperial was Chrysler's bid to unseat General Motors in the luxury arena. By 1958, Cadillac's engine displacements were in the mid-300 cubic inch range, and Imperial boasted a powerful V8 as well, sometimes approaching 413 cubic inches. Lincoln's 430 cubic inch engine was notably larger, but raw displacement alone does not win over luxury buyers. Smoothness, refinement, and brand cachet often matter more. In that regard, Cadillac had a strong hold on the market. Lincoln's approach might have been too heavy-handed, literally, and the public reaction reflected that. Performance was strong in a straight line, but these cars were not exactly nimble. The suspension geometry and weight distribution often resulted in a less controlled feel over uneven pavement. In an era when large cars were common, the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns still managed to stand out for their sheer size. Drivers noted that parking these beasts was no small challenge, and fuel economy was abysmal, even by the standards of the day. The recessionary climate of the late 1950s further dissuaded many potential buyers from splurging on such an imposing automobile. Still, the design had its admirers. The dropped rear window that improved ventilation was a talking point. The trunk was cavernous, although the lid opening was not particularly wide. There were advanced features like a power differential, which Lincoln proudly displayed via a special badge on the rear. The interior, while criticized for certain issues, was undeniably spacious. Some elements of the cabin were gorgeously executed, featuring a stylish dash layout, a selection of gauges, and the distinct 4-spoke steering wheel. The town and country radio switch was another quirk, adjusting radio reception between close by and distant stations. Unfortunately, for every neat feature, there seemed to be a new problem. Some owners complained of persistent squeaks or rattles, despite Ford's efforts to add rigidity. Service was also a challenge. The unibody construction and the unique engineering choices made certain repairs more complicated than on body-on-frame vehicles. As with the Edsel, marketing hype may have built up expectations that reality could not match. Next, we will delve into how these models sold over their short lifespan, and whether the numbers tell the story of a genuine flop or a misunderstood collectible that was simply ahead of its time. Prepare for a reality check on production data, reception by critics, and how quickly Ford altered course. When looking at the production figures for the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns and Continentals, one sees that they did represent a sizable share of Lincoln production. However, that share was relatively small when compared to Cadillac's numbers or even some of Imperial's output. While some sources suggest that the 1958 to 1960 models sold better than earlier post-war Lincolns, they still did not meet Ford's optimistic projections. The entire brand was overshadowed by the Edsel fiasco, which took a toll on Ford's finances and, arguably, on consumer trust. In total, the late 1950s, Lincolns remain a cautionary tale of how bigger is not always better, especially when the market is leaning toward more restrained designs. Many automotive historians note that these Lincolns were truly the end of an era. By the time the 1961 Lincoln arrived, Ford pivoted sharply to a cleaner, more understated body style that would go on to achieve iconic status. especially the Continental with its rear hinge doors and sophisticated lines. That shift was a direct reaction to the feedback that the 1958 to 1960 cars were too large and not refined enough. This new design garnered critical acclaim and helped salvage Lincoln's reputation. Suddenly, the previous models looked like relics of another time, overshadowed by the brilliance of the 1960s Continentals. In the decades since, enthusiasts and collectors have come to value the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns as unique examples of automotive exuberance. Their relative rarity, combined with the over-the-top features, makes them a favorite among certain restoration experts. Parts are not easy to find, especially for specialized components like the vacuum-operated wipers or the unibody-specific structural elements, but the challenge only adds to their mystique. Whether or not these Lincolns deserve to be labeled as one of Ford's greatest flops depends on one's perspective. From a financial standpoint, they certainly did not meet expectations, and they did not command the same loyal following that Cadillac retained. However, from a purely historical or aesthetic viewpoint, they stand as fascinating artifacts of an industry in flux. Before concluding that these Lincolns hold the crown for the worst flop, let us see how they stack up against other notable Ford failures such as the Pinto, the Mustang II, the Bronco II, the Lincoln Blackwood, and a handful of others that demonstrate Ford's capacity to stumble multiple times. Stay tuned, because the Pinto's notorious fuel tank issues and the radical downsizing in the Mustang II reveal a company that sometimes struggled with trade-offs between safety, performance, and affordability. Moving forward in time, the 1970s brought the Ford Pinto, a subcompact car intended to compete with small imports. The Pinto quickly gained a reputation for being unsafe, particularly because of its rear-mounted fuel tank design that could ignite in certain types of collisions. The scandal became public knowledge when internal documents suggested Ford had done a cost-benefit analysis on whether to make the design safer or risk potential lawsuits. This severely harmed Ford's image, making the Pinto a byword for corporate neglect. Although it sold in large numbers initially, thanks to its low price, the legacy it left behind is one of compromised safety and scandal. Soon after, Ford also faced backlash with the Mustang II, introduced for the 1974 model year. While the first-generation Mustang was a runaway success that invented the pony car segment, the Mustang II arrived at a time of rising fuel costs and changing performance regulations. It was smaller and more economical, but enthusiasts lamented its watered-down power and uninspiring styling. Sales were not terrible, but the car remains polarizing among Mustang fans, some of whom consider it a misstep that almost tarnished the Mustang's heritage. Others argue it was necessary to survive the era's fuel crises and shifting regulation. Regardless, it often appears on lists of Ford's less impressive moments. Additionally, the 1980s saw the Bronco II, which was an attempt to shrink the successful Bronco formula. This compact SUV had rollover concerns that plagued its reputation. Then there was the Lincoln Blackwood, a luxury pickup truck introduced in the early 2000s, which was discontinued after just one model year. Buyers were confused about paying a premium price for a truck that offered minimal utility. Around the same time, Ford introduced the retro-styled 2002 Thunderbird, hoping to rekindle the magic of the original two-seat T-Bird. But sales did not meet expectations, and it was canceled after a short run. Cars like the Ford Aspire and the Ford Freestyle also struggled to secure significant market share, failing to leave a notable impact in their segments. The Mercury Marauder, despite nostalgic undertones, never found the wide audience that Ford had hoped for. With so many flops, it is tempting to pick the absolute worst offender. The Edsel often tops the list due to its massive hype and massive disappointment. However, if one looks purely at design miscalculations and consumer rejection, the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns certainly compete for the title, albeit in a different segment and under different economic conditions. Next, discover which factor truly makes a flop the greatest in Ford's storied history. Is it sales figures, public ridicule, or the scale of the corporate blunder? What does it mean to call a vehicle the greatest flop? One might consider the level of investment versus the return on that investment, the loss in brand equity, or the negative publicity that taints the company's reputation for years. In many ways, the Edsel stands out because Ford heavily promoted it. Instead, it became a punchline. The Pinto is another leading contender, not because it sold poorly, but because the safety scandal was so damaging to Ford's image, overshadowing the car's sales numbers. As for the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns, they did sell a moderate number of units, yet they disappointed those who expected Lincoln to take the fight to Cadillac effectively. They also forced Ford to reevaluate its entire approach to luxury cars, leading to major changes for the early 1960s. The lingering question is whether calling these Lincolns one of Ford's greatest flops is truly justified. Financially, they might not have bled as much money as the Edsel or required the kind of legal battles that surrounded the Pinto. Culturally, they never became household jokes or safety pariahs in the same way. On the other hand, the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns were clearly out of step with market preferences, overshadowed by their competition, and emblematic of Ford's inability to read shifting consumer trends. One reason they tend to remain in the shadow of the Edsel is that Lincoln was already an established name, and the Continental brand had limited recognition as a separate division. People remember the Edsel fiasco because it was hammered into the collective consciousness through media stories and comedic references. The Lincolns, conversely, came and went quietly, recognized only by dedicated car watchers. It was really the subsequent success of the 1961 Continental, with its sleek design and association with prominent figures, that sealed the 1958 to 1960 model's fate as a sort of evolutionary misstep. They were a transitional piece in the brand's history, but one that did not fit the public's wants. Stay with this exploration, as the closing arguments will piece together just how the late 1950s Lincolns compared to the likes of the Edsel, Pinto, Mustang II, and other Ford disappointments in the pantheon of automobile history. Another intriguing angle is to see how each flop impacted the culture within Ford. The Edsel led to significant shifts in management and a more cautious approach to launching new nameplates. The Pinto scandal ignited a public relations nightmare and prompted more transparency regarding safety decisions. The Mustang II forced the company to balance performance heritage with fuel economy demands. The 1958 to 1960 Lincolns, while not as high profile in the annals of fiascos, did cause Ford to abandon the strategy of making Lincoln bigger and more garish with each passing year, prompting a search for a new design language that culminated in the 1961 Continental's iconic minimalist aesthetic. That pivot was arguably the saving grace for Lincoln as a brand. While collectors may enjoy the flamboyant styling of the late 1950s models, the 1961 car is widely considered a design classic that resonated with the cultural shift of the 1960s. Meanwhile, on the truck and SUV side of things, mistakes such as the Bronco II's rollover issues taught Ford the importance of safety in utility vehicles, an area where modern offerings like the Explorer and the Expedition have done much better. The Lincoln Blackwood fiasco made it clear that a luxury pickup is a niche market at best, ultimately paving the way for more practical premium trucks like the Ford F-150, Limited or Platinum, which offer luxury without sacrificing functionality. In each case, the lessons learned from these flops inform the next generation of Ford products. This is how the company managed to persevere and remain one of the leading automakers worldwide. Sometimes, stepping back to examine these less successful products illustrates how progress is made in the automotive world. What was once a catastrophic failure can, in hindsight, be seen as a stepping stone toward improvement. In the final analysis, we will see whether the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns deserve a reputation as the absolute worst flop in Ford's history, or if they simply remain a fascinating curiosity that signals a turning point for the brand. Do not lose focus, because this next segment ties everything together, offering a verdict on how all these flops measure up against one another, and which one best fits the title of Ford's greatest flop. So, how do these various failures compare when one tries to single out the biggest flop? The Edsel caused Ford immense financial losses and became a symbol for misguided market research. The Pinto sold well but ultimately tarnished Ford's reputation with a tragic safety scandal that remains a case study in engineering ethics and corporate responsibility. The Mustang II was not a commercial disaster, but it alienated a significant portion of the Mustang's fan base. The Bronco II left a sour taste for those who valued stable handling and off-road credibility. The Lincoln Blackwood proved that not every segment can be combined successfully, and the 2002 Thunderbird showed that nostalgia can carry a car only so far if practicality and broader appeal are lacking. Meanwhile, the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns stand out for different reasons. They were expensive, huge, and emblematic of the tail-finned American excess that, by the end of the decade, was falling out of favor. They never reached the heights of condemnation that the Edsel or Pinto did, but they also did not capture the public's admiration in numbers sufficient to save them from being replaced by a new generation of designs. One might argue that in design terms, they were among the most ambitious attempts Ford made in the luxury realm, only to discover that ambition alone cannot guarantee success. The meltdown occurred because the cars did not align with shifting consumer desires, and the unibody approach created practical issues that overshadowed the advanced thinking behind it. Those who love these cars cherish their distinctiveness and the unique features they offer. They remain misunderstood because many people are unaware of their engineering feats or the story behind their development. While they may not be the absolute worst-selling or most derided vehicles in Ford's history, they do represent a significant lesson about the perils of pushing boundaries without sufficient caution. They also underscore how external factors, such as an economic downturn, can doom a product that might have done better under more favorable conditions. Keep reading, because the final piece of the puzzle will be fitting these cars into the broader narrative of Ford's evolution, revealing how a flop can transform a brand and, oddly enough, help shape future successes. Viewed from a modern perspective, the sheer size and design flourishes of the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns appear almost surreal. They encapsulate the optimism of the 1950s, a decade that believed there was no limit to what American engineering and design could achieve. At the same time, they represent a cautionary tale of overreach, where the reality of market demand fell short of corporate ambition. What is particularly interesting is how quickly Ford pivoted to the sleek lines of the 1961 Lincoln Continental, a car that has since become an icon of mid-century modern design. This swift change implies that the lessons from the previous models were absorbed at the highest levels of Ford's leadership. If these Lincolns had somehow performed admirably in the market, it is possible Ford would have continued along that path, producing ever larger, more extravagant models. Instead, the downturn forced the company to reevaluate and produce something far more restrained, which ironically became a massive success. In this sense, the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns could be seen as the sacrificial lambs that paved the way for the design revolution of the early 1960s. Their failure was not simply due to poor quality or a lack of innovation. Rather, it was a perfect storm of bad timing, misguided assumptions about what luxury buyers wanted, and structural challenges that hampered refinement. Those who have driven or restored these cars often speak of their unique character. They have an undeniable presence on the road, accompanied by period-correct design elements that remind one of an era gone by. Some of their quirks, like the dropping rear window or the unusual HVAC controls, now serve as conversation starters at classic car shows. Enthusiasts maintain that despite their flaws, these Lincolns deserve recognition for the engineering feats they managed to achieve. The question of whether they are Ford's biggest flop is subjective, especially given the competition from the Edsel and others. However, in terms of pure scale and mismatch with consumer sentiment, they stand near the top of the list. It is hard to ignore the Edsel if one is searching for Ford's all-time greatest flop. It was a new brand, introduced with unparalleled fanfare, and it became a symbol of failure. The Pinto has a compelling case too, given its devastating reputation and the moral implications of corporate cost-cutting. Yet, the 1958 to 1960 Lincolns occupy a unique place in the conversation. They might not have caused as loud of a public outcry, but they undoubtedly represent a colossal miscalculation of what luxury car buyers really wanted. Their gigantic footprint and complicated unibody design made them too heavy and too clumsy for a market that was turning its eyes toward more refined models. They sold in moderate numbers, but not enough to validate Ford's investment or vision. The story of these cars is also the story of an industry in flux. The late 1950s saw unprecedented stylistic experimentation, and not all of it resonated with consumers. The flamboyant tailfin era was nearing its end, and the entire country was on the cusp of the more streamlined and modern 1960s. The 1958 to 1960, Lincolns simply arrived at the tail end of a dying design language, burdened by economic factors that Ford might have overlooked. While they introduced fascinating features and could be lauded for their engineering boldness, they failed to resonate with enough buyers to be sustainable. A flop does not always have to be a catastrophic meltdown of sales or a safety crisis. Sometimes, it is just an overly ambitious project that falls short of its lofty goals. These Lincolns fit that description perfectly, staking a claim as one of Ford's biggest regrets. Today, however, those who find one of these survivors in decent shape can revel in the uniqueness they bring to car shows and gatherings. They spark conversation, illustrating how a car can be both a technical marvel and a commercial misfire. They also represent a pivot point that led Lincoln to radically overhaul its design approach, ultimately resulting in the revered 1960s Continentals. In that sense, this so-called flop was also a crucial lesson in design restraint and market alignment. Final thoughts are just ahead, and they wrap up this epic journey through Ford's greatest flops, leaving us to wonder whether failure can indeed be a stepping stone to success. From the Edsel's overblown hype and crushing reality, to the Pinto's reputation-damaging safety scandal, and on through the 1958 to 1960 Lincoln's mismatch with consumer tastes, Ford's history is full of chapters that read like cautionary tales. Each flop contributed a lesson, shaping the company's future decisions and driving home the importance of aligning product vision with real-world conditions. Whether judged by financial losses, public relations nightmares, or pure engineering missteps, these vehicles remain a testament to how even the biggest automakers can get it wrong. Yet, the story does not end in permanent defeat. Ford has often rebounded from these low points, learning from mistakes and finding success in subsequent models. It is a reminder that innovation comes with risk, and risk does not always yield victory. Perhaps that is the true morale of exploring these flops. They show that failures, while painful, can illuminate the path to better designs, smarter marketing strategies, and more durable reputations. The 1958 to 1960 Lincolns, in particular, paved the way for one of the most iconic luxury cars of the 20th century, the 1961 Lincoln Continental, proving that an overreach can lead to a triumphant revaluation. The key is adaptability. Ford's willingness to pivot, whether in response to the Edsel's dismal sales or the Pinto safety crisis, has kept it relevant through global wars, oil shocks, and changing consumer preferences. In the end, calling the 1958 to 1960 Lincoln's Ford's greatest flop might be an overstatement for some observers and entirely justified for others, depending on what criteria one chooses. But without question, they belong in the same conversation as the Edsel and the Pinto when enumerating Ford's missteps. These extravagantly massive luxury cars deserve their place among the manufacturer's legendary flops, simultaneously capturing a moment of unbridled ambition and glaring miscalculation. They have transitioned from misunderstood oddities to automotive curiosities, drawing attention from collectors who see their value as historical artifacts. In that sense, perhaps their flop status only enhances their mystique, proving that sometimes what is scorned in one era can find fans in another. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the complex world of Ford's flops. If there is a central takeaway, it might be that failures should never be forgotten or dismissed. They have much to teach us, whether we are designing the next automobile or simply appreciating the mechanical marvels of the past. Here's to learning from every misstep and never underestimating the power of a good comeback story.